good to be here.
Let me start with some issues in the news I'd like to get your take on, then we'll move to some other things. Let me start in no particular order with the news of a few days ago. We saw the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission headed by former California Treasurer Phil Angelides calling in some big-name persons who had something to do with the mess that we are now in. And I specifically want to talk about Robert Rubin, former head of Citigroup, former Treasury Secretary himself. I want to talk about Alan Greenspan, former Fed chair, and what you make of the fact, and this is not my read, I think most persons who saw this would agree, that they did what they could to back away from taking personal responsibility. How did you read that testimony last week?
You know, I really read it as this wasn't my fault. You know, all I did was run a multi-billion-dollar company, or all I did was run the Fed, this enormously powerful company, enormously powerful agency. But I didn't really understand what was going on here. Excuse me, it was your job to understand. I'm not sure whether it's worse to say, yeah, I understood it, and I went ahead and broke it anyway, or to admit that you were running something like this and you couldn't see the most obvious problems that were developing out there. I just find the whole thing amazing. What
about that notion, Professor Warren, that both of them promulgated that nobody saw this coming, that everybody was duped, you've heard them say this?
I have. And I have to say to you, nobody saw it coming who wanted to keep their eyes tightly closed and their ears covered up. You're absolutely right. There were many people who were talking about the fact that we were building an entire economic structure with these securitized instruments on home mortgages that were not repayable. You know, families making $36,000 had gotten into mortgages that were going to cost them more in monthly payments than they made in a month. We could tell that. It was there. It was obvious. It was on the face of it. And these folks were raking in the money on the city side so fast, and the other Wall Street banks, they couldn't hear it, and the Fed just kept saying, party on. I think part of what gets me about this, though, Tavis, I really want to pause for a minute. Mm-hmm. You started with a key word, and that's personal responsibility. You know, Citibank, very same group that went to Congress and said, you know, you got to change the bankruptcy laws, because when people file for bankruptcy, that's not personal responsibility. And they say that even though people file for bankruptcy in the aftermath of serious medical problems, when they lose their jobs, when their families break up, when somebody dies in the family, that's not personal responsibility if you can't repay Citibank. Here we are in the middle of this mortgage crisis, and just yesterday, J.P. Morgan Chase is testifying to Congress saying, you know, we have mortgages with these people, and they can't break their mortgages because they need to take personal responsibility. I don't get why personal responsibility is a one-way street. It applies to a working person. It applies to somebody who's struggling, somebody who's trying to keep a family going. I'm in favor of personal responsibility there. But why doesn't that apply to CEOs? Why doesn't that apply to heads of the most powerful agencies and arms of government? Why don't they have some personal responsibility?
The Congressional Oversight Panel that oversees TARP, that you in part oversee, put out another report, as you may have heard or know, earlier today on the foreclosure crisis. And I wrote this down because I want to quote it accurately. And they write, despite Treasury's efforts, foreclosures have continued at a rapid pace. What are we to make of that particular report, that foreclosures are not slowing down one bit as yet?
That's right. In fact, let me just give you another number on that. 200,000 families are losing their homes to foreclosure every month right now. And here's Treasury's response. Treasury's had a program. Remember, we're now 3 years into this crisis. Mm-hmm. To be fair, there's been change in administration. This Treasury has had its plan in place for a little over a year now, and they have managed, for every one family, they've managed to get into a modification of their mortgage. 10 more families have lost their homes to foreclosure. So good for the one family, good for Treasury for being able to help one family, but this is a small a small program relative to the scope of the problem we've got, and this problem is not letting up.
Now, specifically, Professor Warren, to the work that you do, we hear from the Treasury Secretary, speaking of Mr. Geithner, that TARP may cost less than originally thought. How do we read that? Is that good news?
Well, there is some good news. In terms of dollars on the table, we're getting more of the money back from TARP. And so it looks like right now we may be down only, you'll pardon me for saying that, about 100, maybe $117 billion. But let me underline here, this isn't just about dollars, because the world changed when we did TARP. The largest Wall Street banks now have an implicit guarantee from the U.S. taxpayer, you and me. And so Citi, for example, Citibank, they have a rating in the marketplace for how solid they are financially. They are getting 3 clicks on their rating, from a double B to an A, not based on their financials. The rating agency said, you know, based on their financials, they'd be down here. But because they have an implicit guarantee from the taxpayers, we're going to rate them a whole lot higher. You know, I pay for homeowners insurance, I pay for car insurance, I pay for health insurance. These guys have don't go broke insurance, only they don't pay a penny for it. So you tell me whether or not we're getting our money's worth out of TARP.